So, hi everyone, thank you for coming to see my talk. This is Choose Your Own Adventure, how we consume narratives in games. So first off, I want to give you all a little info about who I am and my background, so that when you're disagreeing with me later about the content of this talk, you can just sort of get really mean and personal. My name is Joe Neeves. I'm a 2D artist. I do concepts, characters, environments, UI, illustrations, the list goes on. But a lot of my work is fantasy-based, and a lot of that is inspired by my time playing Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I went to NUA for 4 years, 3 on the undergrad Games Art and Design, and 1 on MA Games. And a lot of my work and research there was about fairy tales and narratives and how we tell stories visually, physically, and basically getting into the nitty-gritty about what defines a story, what makes a good story, and the power of games to tell stories differently to films and books. Now, during those 4 years, I spent far too much time writing, drawing, and playing Dungeons and Dragons, to the point that I definitely didn't do enough work. And I'm not a self-help guru, but I'm just going to go on a limb and say that was probably a bad move. But that being said, it did give me a great excuse to spend a lot of time developing my world-building skills and spending a lot of time crafting my own little universes and planning the story beats I wanted to hit, riffing off the players' backstories, and hitting those dramatic moments that really make D&D special. So doing all of that did give me some insight into how to effectively structure narrative in the unpredictable landscape that is tabletop RPGs. And that then changed the way, along with the research that I did in my MA year, about how that I thought of narratives in video games, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. Right now, I mostly work freelance and from commissions, and I make custom D&D stuff. But I do want to start with a little disclaimer, which honestly I feel like should apply to every talk you ever listen to, but a disclaimer. I'm not an industry veteran or a master of game theory or anything like that, but I have spent about 2,000 hours over the last 4 years writing, playing, and watching D&D. So I feel like I have at least a little bit of authority to be able to talk to you about this today. And really, I'm just here to make you think about narratives. If I can make you aware of how you consume the games that the games and the stories that you do. So, without further ado, let's get started. I wanted to start by getting a rough estimate of what you all consider to be narratives. So, on the next few slides, I'm going to show you some games, and I want you to put your hands up if you think that game has a narrative. Okay? Here we go. First one, BioShock Infinite. Literally everyone. Okay, that's what I expected. Cool. Next up, Overwatch. Few less, okay. And finally, the original 1978 Space Invaders. More than I expected. Okay, maybe like half of you. Okay. Some of you might already be on the same page as me then, but let's dig in a little bit into why you might think that. So now, BioShock Infinite is a pretty easy one that apparently everyone agrees with. You experience a story start to finish. It hits the story beats that you would expect of a story in other media, just with shooting and running around in between. And Overwatch is a little bit trickier. There's a universe and an overarching story that's told through comics and voice lines and character designs and levels and things like that. But everything you do in-game isn't canon. Each match isn't an actual event that take place in the universe. Even the Overwatch Archives missions, which are sort of like reliving the missions of the past, aren't necessarily canon. Since there's different difficulties, the characters can all die, the mission can fail. Obviously, all of this exists to make the game actually fun to play, but it does mean that when you're playing the game, you never experience the true events of the story. Whether you believe the match is to be a simulation or whatever, the game itself only alludes to the world that it's built upon. Is that narrative? Do you have to be able to experience an entire cohesive story entirely by playing the game for it to have a narrative? And if you don't, what does that mean for Space Invaders? It might be sparse, but there is an implied backstory. The Earth has been invaded by predictably moving aliens, and with some barriers and a gun turret, you have to push them back. Now, you could argue, and I would agree with you, that Space Invaders doesn't have an end. Most people, when you think of a story, you think of beginning, middle, and end, and Space Invaders doesn't have that. Every wave of aliens is followed by another and another, getting faster and faster and faster, until you lose, and the aliens presumably take over Earth. Does that lack of ending stop it being a narrative? You could argue that Overwatch doesn't have an ending. The universe is constantly expanding. Players of World of Warcraft have experienced, 13 years of expanding narrative constantly. Individual storylines have concluded, but the world continues to change and the story continues to unfold. The overarching narrative of World of Warcraft might never come to an end, not like a book or a movie does. Maybe one day it will stop, with threads left hanging, stories left half told. But I don't think that stops it having a narrative, and maybe you do. You could argue that the impossibility of victory in Space Invaders is actually a high concept message about the futility of resistance against a higher power, or a motivational message about picking yourself up and trying again after failure, bettering yourself against impossible odds. But message and narrative aren't necessarily the same thing, and even then, that's probably stretching the intentions of the creator a little bit too far. In Overwatch, you can win or lose games, you can improve yourself, climb the rank ladder, complete story missions, you can absorb every little bit of transmedia lore that you can find across the entire universe, but playing the game is meaningless in terms of progressing the story. No matter how many times you push the payload to its destination or maintain hold on the moon colony, the game reverts and resets afterwards. You had the enjoyment of playing a game, but not the satisfaction of participating in a story. Despite how much Overwatch lore there is, does that mean it doesn't have a narrative? This is the Oxford English Dictionary definition of narrative, which is a little bit dry, but is also incredibly vague, which really it stands across all media. It applies to novels, films, TV, theatre, comics, games, etc. But is a narrative in a film the same as it is in a game? This definition would suggest so, but could a game play like a film and still succeed? And by succeed here, I don't necessarily mean commercial success or widespread appeal, but more if it feels good to play, if it successfully imparts the message that it wants to the player. I'm going to delve into the Chinese Room's Dear Esther a little bit. So for those of you who don't know about Dear Esther, it was originally a free mod that was made for the Source engine, and then was redeveloped and re-released as its own title in 2012. You play as an anonymous man who is exploring this remote island in the Hebrides. And as you explore, you hear these snippets of letters that he wrote to his late wife, Esther. And as you play the game, you piece together their relationship and the events of the story. Now, I'm sure that if you've heard of this game already, you probably heard of the debate/controversy that surrounded it when it came out. Dear Esther was special in that there's really no interactivity in the entire game. You can't pick up items or solve puzzles or run from enemies. Literally, the only controls are movement and looking. Dear Esther was critically acclaimed for its visuals and its sound and its genre-defining design, but it was also criticised for this lack of interactivity. To some people, Dear Esther wasn't a game. For them, a game had to be interactive. It had to involve the player in game systems. Now, I don't think you can deny that Dear Esther had a narrative, but you have no impact on it. There were no choices, no puzzles. You could enact no meaningful change within Dear Esther. On the face of it, the only choice you had was when you stopped. And just like a book or a film, or like Space Invaders, when you stop, the story is over, kind of unsatisfyingly. Now, the choice to design Dear Esther this way was obviously intentional. You don't accidentally make a game like this. But it can be watched like a movie. The whole game is about an hour and a half long, and there's plenty of YouTube videos that are just commentary-less renditions of it. But there is something to be said for having this experience in your hands. To start with, the letters that you hear each playthrough are randomized, so you won't necessarily understand the full picture first time through. If nothing else, your playthrough will be different because you heard the letters in a different story, in a different order, sorry. What's more important, though, and what you lose when you're watching a movie-style rendition of it on YouTube, is the choice of when to move on, when to stop and watch the scenery, when to wait in an area because you like the music and you don't want to change the track accidentally. If you wanted to, you could spend 30 minutes, you could spend 9 days if you wanted to, just standing in a cave watching the plants move. In 2012, Dan Pinchbeck, who is the creative director for Dear Esther, I'm going to apologise for the slide here because there is so much text on it, but he described this effect in an interview with IGN. So all the devices in Dear Esther are encouraging the player to slow down and focus intensely. You get this incredible building kind of emotional journey. If the player's got stuff to think and feel about, they'll use that time to think and feel about it. The game gives up this instant gratification of solving a puzzle or defeating an enemy for a sort of slow, creeping thoughtfulness, which does add something to the narrative experience that you couldn't achieve in another medium. When an excerpt really packs a punch, or there's a dramatic line that you need a moment to mull over what you just learned, you can take exactly the time you need, and not a moment longer, without interrupting the experience like pausing a film or just stopping to read a book. Now, I'm not going to get into the argument of whether Dear Esther is a game or not, because honestly, it's the dullest argument I think I've ever heard. But it's been beaten to death, and I think that anyone with a real understanding of what makes Dear Esther really haunting and so special understands that it's not quite the same experience when you're not in the driver's seat, and it's definitely more than a film. What's even more interesting to me, though, are the games that came after it. Dear Esther really did kickstart an entire genre, even though Walking Simulator was used as a sort of derogatory term at Dear Esther's release, is now a blanket term used to describe these games, like Campo Santo's Firewatch, or Giant Sparrow's What Remains of Edith Finch. Both of these games are walking simulators, but neither of them are really laboured by the is it even a game argument like Dear Esther was. Now, obviously, Dear Esther was released in 2012. That's 4 years before Firewatch and 5 before Edith Finch. And absolutely, some of that controversy stemmed from people who first saw the game on the newly released page on Steam or whatever, and bought the game and it wasn't what they expected it to be. But both of these games include some level of more traditional interactivity. In Edith Finch, when you're experiencing the story of a little girl who was sent to bed hungry, you enter her imagination, transforming into a cat that leaps across the branches to catch a bird. And then the game changes into a series of mini-game vignettes, inhabiting different predators, catching their prey before moving on to the next scene. In Firewatch, the systems maybe aren't so grand. You have dialogue choices when you're talking over the radio, there are items to pick up and obstacles to overcome. These sorts of things don't need to be complicated weaving systems, but they're things that players recognise as parts of games. An obstacle which, however small, must be overcome in order to continue. Dear Esther definitely had something interactive about what you choose to look at and when you decide to move on, but it's so subtle that to a lot of players, they probably didn't even realise that that was a choice that they had. It wasn't a choice of path to take or group to ally yourself with. It was control over the pace of your experience, how fast you read the book, so to speak, except here the book keeps being beautiful and sounding amazing when you're not reading it. So if interactivity is an established part of games as experiences, and if you consider that maybe they do need interactivity, that's up to you to decide, but it's also something which can't be done in films or books or other media. And what about leaning into that uniqueness more? Firewatch and Edith Finch have interactivity, but the stories don't change based on your actions. If I were to take the story of Firewatch into a D&D campaign, all the players would soon realise that they didn't actually have any control. Whatever actions they take, the game can't progress until they complete the task that I've set out of them in the way that I expected them to complete it, whereupon the story progresses in the way that I expected it to. Think about the Fighting Fantasy series, some of which were recently, over the last few years, made into mobile games. They're probably the most well-known choose-your-own-adventure series ever written. They're these incredibly intricate stories where the people you talk to and the items you collect either bring you to victory or doom you to a gruesome death, sometimes completely arbitrarily. Here, your choices matter, and the book/game reminds you of it at every possible corner. When you finish reading a passage and the book says, if you have the purple candle, turn to 143, and you go, oh, why didn't I buy the purple candle? I knew I was going to be useful. I just bought this useless magic potion instead. If the lack of purple candle hasn't led your character to be ground into a fine paste, then maybe later a different passage will tell you about a sick child. And if you've got the magic potion, you can attempt to cure them. Turn to 83 and you'll go, oh, I knew that magic potion was good for something. That is agency, the ability to effect meaningful change to the narratives presented. Sometimes it comes in a form of instant gratification, like nuking an enemy city in Civ and seeing their score crumble as the rest of the world declares war on you. Sometimes it's slow, like accepting a bribe from a man in Papers, Please and having your house raided a week later because your nosy neighbour reported your sudden luxury to the authorities. Sometimes it's both, like Telltale's now iconic "they will remember that" line, prompt after making a dialogue choice that pops up, and then that choice coming back to bite you an episode or two later. Now, those of you who read the blurb of this talk on the NGF website might remember that I mentioned some controversial statements that would appear in this talk. So here comes the first one. Shadow the Hedgehog on PS2 was an okay game. So this is the game which saw aliens invade Earth and the subsequent war against the amazingly named Guardian Units of Nations. It's a governmental body just called GUN. This is a game which IGN described as having a long list of shortcomings, from stupid level design, unrefined controls, and useless gunplay to disappointingly outdated graphics. Now, this game did come out in 2005, so I guesstimate that I was maybe 12 when I played it. Not the most critically minded, of course, so I'd forgive you for doubting what's about to come out of my mouth, but this incredibly low-resolution image is the best part of the game. This is mission select, although you don't necessarily get to directly choose what mission you're doing next. Instead, starting from left to right, the way you play the level dictates where you go next. If you complete the hero task as you race through the stage, usually doing something beneficial to gun or defeating some aliens, protecting civilians, something like that, and you'll head up a row when you move on to the next stage. Complete the dark mission, usually destroying like a tank squad or killing a number of enemies with an alien weapon, and you'll drop down a row. Complete neither, and you'll stay the course. So here, the player's gone neutral, and then hero, dark, and then hero again. Now, aside from this mechanic dictating which level you head to, it also has relevance to the rest of that story route. There are 326 different routes through Shadow the Hedgehog. Now, admittedly, the game doesn't make a huge distinction between which specific path you take. So, for example, both of these routes have exactly the same ending. But a lot of fairy tales end with a happy ever after, and they're not the same story. So, in fact, each potential route has a unique name. The game does recognise when you have taken a different route than before. So they can be named the full villain playthrough called Punishment, Thy Name is Ruin, and the somehow weirder named Miracle of Love. But what I'm saying is that the journey is as important as the ending. So even though you probably don't want to play through all 326 different versions of Shadow the Hedgehog unless you're some kind of psychopath, it wouldn't be strange to take a few multiple routes, especially when a full playthrough only takes about an hour and a half, the same sort of length as Dear Esther. What this screen demonstrates is the power of agency. The choices you make in each level decides the rest of the story you'll experience. Shadow the Hedgehog makes you feel in control of these choices because the game plainly lays them out as soon as you start. It establishes a contract with the player, an expectation that your choices matter, and that helps involve players in the narratives presented, and then also encourages constant engagement with the game itself. If your choices mean something, there's a reason to observe, think, and decide. And that's especially important in a franchise like this, when it doesn't frequently ask its players to stop and consider their path. Laying out the stages like this might seem a little heavy-handed in other franchises. This isn't a catch-all, amazing way of doing narratives. It would be like playing a Telltale game, and the options that will have story repercussions are labelled with things like, warning, doing this will make you evil, or if you say this, they'll shank you in 4 weeks. But Shadow the Hedgehog broke convention, and that's why showing you the importance of your choices is genius. It's the narrative equivalent of when an item's name goes red in Fallout if someone will be mad at you for stealing it. It wordlessly tells you, right from the start, your choices matter, so listen up. Now, agency is a topic which comes up a lot in tabletop RPG communities, alongside the concept of railroading. So remember earlier when I was talking about Firewatch, and about how it wouldn't translate well into a D&D campaign because of how linear and predetermined it is. That's railroading. It's when a dungeon master or a game master forces the players down a prescribed route because that's the story they want to tell, generally regarded as one of the biggest faux pas a DM can make. Players almost always despise being railroaded because it turns a game of decisions and luck into a glorified book reading. If I, as a player of D&D, discover that my DM has already predetermined the outcome of the story that they wrote, why am I even here? Why not just write it down and not waste everyone else's time by pretending to play out this endlessly branching story, the path through which has already been decided? The lack of agency makes you feel unimportant. So with the knowledge of systems like those in Shadow the Hedgehog and D&D, it's easy to see why Dear Esther might have had such a backlash. So why even make a game like that? As a DM, you do sometimes have to nudge players in the right direction. After all, I don't have an endless amount of time to craft a truly endless open world for my players to enjoy. I'd like to think that I'm pretty good at D&D improv, but there's a limit to how far that can take you when you're trying to maintain a consistent and varied and interesting universe. So sometimes you have to convince your players that they're making a choice on their own, when really there was only one possibility. So I'm going to give you an example of that now, but I want to preface it by saying that doing this in a real D&D game is almost always a bad move, because one way or another, either intentionally or not, your players will find a way to screw you over. But this is the easiest way to show you what I mean. So imagine you're all playing D&D and you're traversing a cave system. There's a fork in the road. The left path falls into darkness quickly as the mushrooms that glow can't grow there. The right path ascends a little and you can hear the distant chittering of bats and perhaps something more echoing down the mine shaft. Now, obviously, characters in a party will often disagree about the best course of action. Here, though, the choice was irrelevant. I've only written one open cavern where you'll face off against a deadly beholder before claiming your treasure and fleeing from the cave-in caused by its death throes. And unlike in Shadow the Hedgehog, where your choices might give you a different play experience for the next 20, 30 minutes, each of those paths might only last a minute or two. I gave the impression that your choice mattered, but behind the scenes, I know it didn't. This is the illusion of agency, an effect used a lot in both tabletop RPGs and video games. How many dialogue choices in a Telltale game actually let you impact the future story? Now, I don't know for certain because I'm on the same side of the DM screen to you, but I'd be willing to wager that a significant amount of those lines actually give you very little control about the direction that you're headed. There's two reasons why this happens in video games. One is the same reason I've done it in D&D, time constraints. Crafting an extra possible route from my campaign might take me an hour or two. For a game studio, that could be weeks or months of work for dozens of people, for content that a decent amount of players might not even see. A decent number of players won't even see the end of your game, especially if you're crafting a 100-hour epic. And if you have 3 mutually exclusive paths, then the majority of players who do reach the end won't even see 2/3 of those routes. Going even further, are those multiple routes actually giving your players true agency? Every potential choice and pathway still has to be dictated by the developers. They're all custom-made paths. The game doesn't react on the fly. This is the second reason why the illusion of agency exists in games. Computers aren't good enough at improv. Which brings me to my second wild statement. Maybe Skynet wouldn't be so bad. No, obviously I'm being facetious because living in the world of Terminator is a hellscape that I'm sure we'll all get to experience in the next few decades. But the benefit that AI supercomputers might bring is a digital network that can rival the improv skills of the human brain. Now, without artificial intelligence, games cannot be completely adaptive. The incredible complex systems like those in Divinity Original Sin and Original Sin 2 create an atmosphere where a great number of things are possible. Enough that you certainly won't see them all in a single playthrough. Maybe not in 5, 10, 20, 100 playthroughs, you won't see everything. But they're not infinite worlds. One of the reasons I adore Dungeons & Dragons is that it is so many stories in one. And this is my final controversial statement for the day, which is probably the lesser of all three. Literally everyone should be playing D&D. I really do think that it is for everyone, and it's every story, because it can be intensely personal and utterly cooperative. It can be a serious, sprawling epic, and at the same time, unpredictable comedy with your friends. It makes you closer as a group of people. It forges memories that are the backbones of friendships. It's getting mad at your mate because she accidentally shot your horse, and then bawling as the fate of a fictional character falls down to a single dice roll. It makes you better at speaking. It helps combat social anxieties. And all the while being fun as hell to play. And at least for now, it can't be truly replicated in a video game. And now that sounds kind of dismissive, especially when I've spent the rest of this talk singing the praises of agency in narrative experiences. But I want you to make up your own mind about how important you think agency is in games. Personally, I do think it's important to at least believe that you have agency, even when you suspect you might not. To suspend disbelief, just as you would when you go to the theatre, to believe that the actors in front of you are really those characters, that the story is actually playing out in front of you. Maybe that's an overly optimistic point of view, but I do think that if you go into a game expecting your choices not to matter, you're getting off on the wrong foot. Going into a game with the belief that you as a player matter helps immerse you in the experience and allows you to truly understand how powerful a lack of agency can sometimes be. So I'm going to take you back to What Remains of Edith Finch now. This is a game where you relive the final moments of your ancestors. Honestly, I could have done an entire talk about this game because I love it so much. But there is one story in particular which I think really highlights how powerful the illusion and lack of agency can be. In one of the final stories, the game really beautifully blends the physical and the imaginary when you play as a man working at a fish cannery. In the physical world, you use the right stick to pick up fish that come onto the production line and then place them under a guillotine, which slams down with this wet metallic thud. Whilst the screen becomes more and more fuzzy as the man's mind drifts, making it harder and harder to feel in control of this dangerous machinery you're operating. This fuzziness becomes the man's story. With the left stick, you make choices in his imagination that tell you about his life, whether he seeks out adventure or prefers the peace and quiet, whether his imaginary hero falls in love with a beautiful prince or a handsome queen. You're given control of who this man was, and though it ultimately doesn't matter, it makes you protective and invested and empathetic. The scene is beautiful and enlightening about his life, but also dreadful and sickening. You know that this man dies. It's the conceit of the entire game. And although you're not sure exactly how, every wet slice of that blade fills you with this sense of impending doom as your control of the physical is slowly wrenched from your grasp. You know you can't save him from his fate, but the context as a game makes you wonder if maybe if you work quickly enough, safely enough, if you play out the story in his imagination soon enough, then just maybe you'll be able to change the story. And when it's no longer just his, it's your imaginary prince, walks into the imaginary throne room, and you see at the sight of his imaginary coronation, not an imaginary throne, but a very real guillotine, your heart sinks that much harder because you made him. You tried so hard, and yet, as you always knew deep down, you were powerless. That scene could never be recreated in another medium, not with the same impact. As a film or a book, you could preserve the impact of the reveal of his death, but it wouldn't carry the same weight as a man who you helped make. His life was dull and boring and repetitive and sad, and you breathed life into his imagination, all the while struggling to keep him safe, and then he died. In this story, you didn't have agency. Your choices cannot change the past. Whoever you decide this man was, really, doesn't matter. What mattered was that you made him, and that in whatever form he took, he was yours. Even though you know the choices don't matter, it sort of tricks you into thinking that they do. But then when the veil is lifted and you see the truth, it doesn't feel cheap or lazy like it might in a D&D game. Maybe because your agency or lack thereof isn't the be-all and end-all. As much as I love D&D, an infinity of choices doesn't necessarily make for a good story. If you're going to take one thing from this talk, let it be this. Regardless of whether you think video games give you true agency or not, you don't always need it. A narrative without agency isn't always bad, and a narrative with 100 branching paths isn't always good. It's a tool to be given or taken to elicit a reaction from the player. And if its presence or absence pulls that emotion out of you, then it's doing your job, choice or not. Before I leave you all in peace, I do have one more type of narrative that I want to talk to you all about. So cast your minds back to the first 10 minutes of this talk when we were all bright-eyed and optimistic about our futures. And remember the conclusion that I came to about Overwatch. That after finishing a match, you had the enjoyment of playing the game, but not the satisfaction of participating in a story. What if we shift our perspectives for a moment and look at the game from the angle that even these non-canon matches can create a narrative? Look at the pushes and pulls of the match, the fights that were won or lost on split-second decisions, the hero changes, the jaw-dropping plays, the disastrous whiffs. It might not be something which you immediately think of as a narrative, but there is a story there, the story of one team's victory over another. It's why people watch esports and traditional sports, why people follow the story of their favourite teams as they fight it out in all of the universes across all of the games. There is a narrative there, a kind of meta-narrative almost, which appears spontaneously from the players of the game, not the game itself. This is Emergent narrative. It's a narrative which originates within the game systems, but isn't dictated by the lore of the game or the developers who made it. And it's not limited to a single genre. Games that you'd not always consider to have narratives, like Space Invaders, can bring forth emergent narratives, the stories you tell about playing the game. They can be personal, something that you keep to yourself, the razor-thin win that you wrench from the opponent's hands in a competitive game, or screaming at your friend across a living room when they steal all your stars in Mario Party. It's what games like The Sims are entirely based on. The game provides the system, but the players provide the story. Whether that's a traditional story of a couple starting a family and pursuing their dream careers and growing old together, or a less conventional story about how Boba Fett and Ray Romano from Everybody Loves Raymond got together, and they went for a swim in their garden only for the ladder to suddenly disappear and trap them there forever in a watery doom, as a very enormously chinned Darth Vader watches on. They're not stories that the developers could have possibly foreseen, and they're not restricted by the game itself. Fan art communities, fan fiction, mods, theory crafting, all the rest, they're all a type of emergent narrative. It's a huge part of what gaming culture is today. Even more than fan art, it's gaming YouTube and Twitch. It's the basis of every Minecraft Let's Play ever made. The desire to tell your story. It was the springboard for this talk, that moment in Edith Finch that still sits with me today, 8 months after playing it? It's the agency to create your own stories. And it can't be given or taken away. It's the memories you hold dear about your most meaningful gaming experiences, your own personal narrative, which might have been birthed from the consumption of another, but was entirely created by you and the people around you. And if you ask me, that is the most exciting adventure at all. They're the narratives which I remember most fondly. Literally last night, as I was doing a final proof of this talk, I saw a video by Jenna Stober, who's a video producer at Polygon. She's a general authority on horror and video game culture. And the way she concluded her video seemed so perfect here that I had to edit it and put it in for today. She said that you don't really have to know any of this to enjoy your content, to enjoy your stories. And you don't always have to be analysing these messages, but it's good to tune in every once in a while and ask yourself, what is this trying to get me to think and feel, or not think and not feel? The next time you're playing a game, have a think about how that game's narrative exists. If it's a zero-agency walking simulator, think about what effect that achieves, whether you think it would be a better experience if there were choices, and what choices they would be. Or if this is a story where all you need is to be able to decide for yourself when to move on. When you're next stumped by a difficult choice in a game, think about whether those choices are everything you want, and how much impact those choices are having on your experience. And when you next cry with laughter with an absurd bug that's stripped your character down to nothing but a floating torso, think about how powerful a medium games can be to be able to do all of that, to invoke such emotion and create these narratives within themselves. And I think you'll appreciate how powerful those narratives can be, even when you don't realise they're there. Thanks so much for listening.